Okay, well, it's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Levi Bryant today, who you'll all know, and he's the author of a really good book on Deleuze, Difference and Givenness, which explores Deleuze's transcendental empiricism, and also the democracy of objects and ontocartography. And he's the co-editor of the Speculative Turn too. So as well as Deleuze, he's been very influential in the object-oriented ontology movement, and you'll probably know him from his Larval Subjects blog too. He's also written on Badiou and Zizek and Lacan, and he's also a Lacanian psychoanalyst. Is that right?
Yeah, I don't do that anymore, but for a number of years I imprudently did.
Gosh. So he's presenting a paper today called Some Themes of Wilderness Ontology. Okay, thanks, Levi.
All right, thank you for that kind introduction and for having me here today. And I apologize for reading to you, but that's the nature of the beast. And so in 2017, back in the before times when something called travel existed, a group of Norwegian archaeologists involved in a project called Object Matters invited me to give a talk in Oslo. As a philosopher, or at least someone who has some degree of expertise in philosophy, you can imagine that this invitation caused me no small amount of consternation. At the time, I knew nothing of archaeology. What, I wondered to myself, could I possibly have to say to a group of archaeologists? Surely I would make a fool of myself. I reasoned to myself that they must be interested in my work because, as archaeologists, they are all, above all, interested in objects or things, those mysterious artifacts they pull from the earth, and much of my work in the last decade has been about the ontology of things. However, given that archaeologists work daily with objects, those shards of pottery, bones, and excavated temples that make up the bread and butter of their work, know far more about objects than I could ever hope to know. What could I possibly have to say to them about objects or things that they did not already know? My anxiety only increased when I began digging into the Norwegian Object Matters project. When I then thought of archaeology, I thought of Indiana Jones, ancient temples, pyramids, embalmed mummies, and burial cairns. However, they are doing something quite different. What strange sort of wizardry was this, I wondered? They were proposing something entirely foreign to me, what I would later come to think of as an archaeology of the contemporary. What could an archaeology of the contemporary possibly be? Of what value could an archaeology of the contemporary have? What could an archaeology of the contemporary, and even more outlandishly, an archaeology of the future, possibly have to teach us? Here I hasten to add that I am using the term archaeology literally to signify that discipline that actually digs in the soil, and not metaphorically as in the case of Foucault in his book of that title. I was skeptical and intrigued. When I finally gave my talk in Oslo, I gave a critique of Graham Harman's object-oriented ontology, defending a continuity account of beings, the being of objects, rather than conceptualizing objects as discrete. There I argued that we should conceive objects as pleats or folds, as individuals rather than individuals, in which things are thought of as pleats of being always attached to the field or a world. However, in the roundtable that followed that talk the next day, I gave a brief discussion of the basic claims of the machine-oriented ontology I had developed, and then spent, much to their surprise, the remainder of the time asking them all sorts of questions about their project and what it's all about. I had been given 3 hours to talk during the roundtable, but only spoke for 45 minutes. In retrospect, this seems like it might have been rude. And indeed listened as they explained what they are up to. That discussion followed us when we went to a local pub later that evening. And I found myself utterly captivated by their discussion of World War II Russian POW camps they had surveyed, landfills, abandoned Soviet military and science installations, portions of the Nazi Atlantic Wall, and Nazi bunkers, sunken submarines, and many other things besides. At some point, I expressed envy and said that I would love to do such a thing. Bjornar Olsen, the head of the project, looked at me startled. He and his colleague, Tora, looked at one another, and in unison, they said they would make that happen. I thought this was just a polite and kind thing to say, of the sort that hosts sometimes say at conferences and talks, and promptly forgot about it when I returned to my home in Dallas, Texas. Much to my surprise, I heard from them a year later, asking which of their 5 expeditions I would like to accompany them on. A few months later, I would find myself in the Arctic Circle in August in a remote and uninhabited region of Norway called Sverholt. And most of these pictures are from Sverholt. It took me 5 days to reach this desolate place. First, I had to fly from Dallas to Oslo. I then had to catch a flight from Oslo to Tromsø in northern Norway. From there, we had to load up our gear, 2 vans and a car, and head to Finland for supplies. I was delighted to discover that there are literally reindeer everywhere in Finland. They really are like flies. From there, we then went to the northernmost village in Norway, Honningsvåg, where we were ferried across a fjord in a small 30 or 40-foot fishing boat piloted by an ancient fisherman in his 70s or 80s who was famous for having caught the largest halibut in Norway and meeting the queen. We had to transport all of our gear from the boat to the shore using a small 2-meter dinghy, where we had to carry it inland on the isthmus to the World War II Russian POW camp where we would make our camp. This was no small feat. The beach was covered with small, slippery rocks the size of fists. There was rotting barbed wire and landmines left over from the Nazi Atlantic Wall during World War II and the occupation. While breathtakingly beautiful, Sverholt is a cold and inhospitable place. Even in August, the temperature hovered around 5 degrees Celsius or below. Because it was summer, the sun never set, but rather circled endlessly in the sky. There was a constant drizzle of cold rain, making the rocks, decaying building foundations, and tall grass endlessly slick and dangerous. There was no running water nor electricity, but rather we had to clean all of our dishes and ourselves in the same tiny stream that the Russian POWs would have had to use to bathe for cleaning and as their only source of water. And so that's the picture with the orange bucket there. That's the stream. Despite having a good pair of boots, they were soaked through by the second day, and I had to resort to muck gardening boots that resemble those worn by the Frankenstein Hollywood monster. By the second day, I was walking like an old man, utterly exhausted by the terrain filled with hills, mountains, and slick grass. I can't imagine what it must have been like for the Russian prisoners of war who built the fortifications of the Atlantic Wall, wearing shoes made of nothing but bits of rubber wrapped in fabric around their feet and calves. With a good pair of boots, it was bad enough for me in the summer. It must have been utter hell in the cold, frozen, endless night of the Norwegian winters wearing those shoes. From an archaeological perspective, Sverholt is a very special place. Not only is there the ruins of the Russian POW camp and the Nazi Atlantic Wall that we were there to survey, but there are prehistoric home foundations and whale rendering pits that date back 10 to 15,000 years, as well as an abandoned and deteriorating fishing village that dates back to the Middle Ages. Michel Serres invites us to conceive time not as a line from past to future, nor as a phenomenological temporality where we pull from the past, projecting a future in front of ourselves so as to give rise to the living present of our concernful engagement, but rather as a crumpled piece of paper where points from the past appear in the future and present, and the future is sometimes of the past. A topological conception of time which, as Chris Whitmore, one of the archaeologists on our expedition to Sverholt, calls percolating time. This is certainly what Sverholt is like. Time is folded in on itself in all sorts of complex and percolating ways where things from the remote past continue to impact the present, such that we can say with Bergson that the past is not past, but is right there folded into the present as the most contracted point of the past. Somewhere, Bjorn Olsen, upon encountering a poor reindeer entangled in the barbed wire from World War II, asks, did the war ever end? To be sure, there are no soldiers and nations involved in the war, yet the things of war remain and continue to act upon the world in all sorts of unexpected ways. In the last 2 days of our expedition, bad weather befell us. The seas were the worst that they had been for 20 years, with waves that seemed to me taller than 3-story buildings. The bay from which we entered the isthmus was far too treacherous for the fishing boat to enter. So we had to portage all of our gear across the low mountain to the abandoned fishing village about 2 kilometers away on the other side, taking trip after backbreaking trip to carry it all there. When we were finally able to get it all on the boat, we made our trip across the fjord. What had taken 2 hours to get there now took 5 hours. The boat would rise high into the ocean on the waves, only for the wave to disappear and for us to plummet through the air back down to the water. Sometimes the boat would shift sideways and we would be looking into the ocean. Our gear danced all about the deck of the boat. In the small cabin, we would fly off of our feet, hitting the ceiling. The ancient captain, and I mean, this is an 80-year-old man, he could have dropped over, laughed maniacally as he gunned the engine to conquer the oncoming waves. Fumes crept up from the engine room, causing us to cough and grow dizzy, and people vomited out the window. It felt to me like we were close to death, yet somehow we made it back to Königsweg. None of us were quite sure why I was there. Was I doing something like Luturian ethnographic fieldwork, observing how scientists do their work? I did come to appreciate how much work and how many mediators are needed to produce archaeological knowledge. Was I there to dig and survey myself? Dig I did, experiencing the backbreaking yet rewarding work of meticulously excavating midden pits where you always find buried treasure, if only in the form of a shard of glass or porcelain, a cod bone, a fishing hook, or a bone. All of these things tell some story of how people lived. Was I there simply to amuse them? No doubt. Later, they would simply tell me that none of the speakers they had ever invited had asked much about their own work, instead simply talking about their research in the humanities and social sciences. I had asked about them and expressed a desire to see what they do. I suspect they wondered what would happen if they brought a philosopher, if that I am, into the field. They later invited me to become an external scholar with their new project called Unruly Heritage. I appreciate your patience for listening to my adventure story, and while I do enjoy in telling the story, I'm still amazed and shocked that I was ever able to do such a thing. I do tell it for a reason. In Difference and Repetition, Deleuze rejects the thesis that thought is a natural aptitude that we can exercise spontaneously and at will. When we strive to will ourselves to think, he says, we are only rewarded with the recognized, with an image of myself projected on ourselves, projected onto the world. Our thought becomes nothing but a mirror of ourselves and our pre-existing cognitive and semiotic categories. Rather, something must force us to think, he says. We must have an encounter. An encounter is akin to the Lacanian real. It is a rupture in the field of the symbolic in our cognitive categories by which we encounter the untimely and unprecedented, or that for which we have no categories. It is there, in and through an encounter, that thinking takes place. Philosophy is not, I think, a subject or discipline like other disciplines, for philosophy is a discipline without an object, and perhaps even without a subject. In this regard, and I am not disparaging philosophy, but praising it by saying this, philosophy is an empty discipline, an empty square that is always becoming something other than it was when it manages to take place. In referring to philosophy as something that might or might not take place, I am suggesting that philosophy does not always exist or happen. In this regard, philosophy is more an event than a subject. To be sure, traces of philosophy are always available to us in the form of texts that we have written and that we inherit. But the event of philosophy where philosophy happens and takes place, that is not something that is always with us. Where in archaeology you can point to ruins as the object of inquiry, and in biology you can point to organisms and cells, and in history you can point to the archive, and in physics you can point to objects in motion and various forms of matter, and in mathematics you can point to numbers, shapes, patterns, and relations, there is no object we can point to and say, those are the objects philosophy investigates. We therefore struggle to articulate what philosophy is. It is always a question to itself. And often philosophy, unsure of what it is about, becomes about philosophers or its history. In our introductory classes, we often say that philosophy is not about the novel, cells, organisms, molecules, subatomic particles, the anatomy of the body, and so on, but about a certain set of questions. What is knowledge and the limits of knowledge? What is being or the ultimate structure of reality? What is the good life or the best life? What are norms and what are our duties? What is art? And so on. This route is perhaps more promising, yet then philosophy often degenerates into schools of thought where we have rationalists pitted against empiricists, idealists pitted against empiricists and realists, phenomenologists pitted against ordinary language philosophers, and all the rest. In other words, we proceed as if these questions are the same and admit of a single univocal answer. But is Kant really asking the same question that Epicurus or Spinoza is asking when he asks what the good life is? Is Descartes really asking the same question Plato is asking when he asks what knowledge is? The words might be the same, but is the sense of the question the same? Are the problems really the same? Somewhere or other, Deleuze suggests that a good philosophical reading of a text strives to reconstruct the problem or problems to which that text is a response. What problem or problems, we might ask, necessitated the creation of these concepts and no others? Here it is important to note that the problem or problems that animate a thinker, while immanent in their thought, are seldom spoken or articulated in their thought. In this regard, problems form a sort of unconscious of the text and thinker, of which the thinker, him or herself, is barely aware. It animates their thought in the manner of Bergsonian memory without being present to their thought. In this regard, the problem of Descartes' thought wouldn't be the question of what can I be certain or how can I attain certainty, but perhaps something like, how can I do the new science without getting on the wrong side of the Spanish Inquisition? Or how can we put an end to all of this brutal religious warfare that arose out of the Reformation, where interpretations of scripture proliferated, spawning dozens of different competing forms of Christianity, all convinced that they had the truth, all striving to appease God so there wouldn't be a return of the plague or the Little Ice Age. The problems that animate a thinker often are not things that appear in the work of the thinker. In television, Lacan tells us that reality is not the real. The real is of the order of the encounter, of the rupture, whereas reality is a sort of synthesis of the symbolic, the system of categories by which we make sense of the universe, and the imaginary, the order through which we think we have mastered the universe in a totality or whole. Here and there, the real peeks through like a sort of grimace, humiliating our categories, challenging them, and sense of imaginary mastery that we properly categorized everything in a net from which nothing can escape. In this connection, we think of philosophy as a sort of response to the eruption of the real that puts the lie to reality. In What is Philosophy?, Deleuze and Guattari propose that philosophy is the creation and critique of concepts, with the caveat that the creation of concepts is not some arbitrary activity where we encounter whatever concept, where we create whatever concepts we might like based on whatever catches our fancy. There is a rigor to the creation of concepts and a necessity, but always in response to a problem. In Difference and Repetition, Deleuze remarks that we always get the solutions we deserve based on the problems that we have posed. He is quick to add that for this reason, there are monstrous solutions, such as the Jewish solution, that are the result of poorly posed problems. There is thus a sort of autogenesis of solutions from problems. The better we pose a problem, the more solutions come into relief as a function of those problems, despite the fact, as he says, that solutions in no way resemble the problems out of which they arise. For this reason, he claims that we should apply the criteria of the true and the false, not to solutions or propositions, but to problems themselves. Unfortunately, he tells us little as to how we might go about doing this. At any rate, we can think of concepts as solutions that respond to what might be called problematic fields. They are resolutions of problems that then become guides for practice and inquiry. Here, then, we might find fertile ground for formulating a hypothesis, nothing but a hypothesis, as to what philosophy as a subject or discipline might be. Philosophy, I wish to suggest, aims to create concepts adequate to its time. The aim is to create concepts that render our time thinkable. This would be why philosophy does not always exist. Rather, there has to be something like what Bachelard calls an epistemological break or rupture, a crisis within reality that throws reality into a state of crisis. There is in a word, an eruption of the real that disrupts all of the categories by which we comprehend ourselves, society, and the universe we live in, that is the object of a fundamental encounter that forces us to think and create concepts that might render our time thinkable. Sometimes that eruption of the real will be a startling new discovery in the sciences or mathematics, forcing us to rethink what knowledge is. At other times, it will be a technological transformation that fundamentally changes how we live. At yet other times, it will be a fundamental transformation in how we live with each other in society, and how we produce things that forces us to rethink what society is and what it ought to be. For example, factory production and capitalist exchange seized Marx, leading him to ask what society is and could be. There is always a prior eruption of the real that calls everything into question. And this would be both why philosophy always returns, because, as Lacan said, the real is that which always returns, and why philosophy does not always exist, because there's not always these ruptures. There are long periods where reality as a synthesis of the imaginary and the symbolic functions more or less well as a means for understanding ourselves, society, how to live, and the universe, because there have been no major eruptions of the real disrupting the order of reality. Alternatively, taking a page from Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions, we could perhaps say that there is normal philosophy and revolutionary philosophy. Revolutionary philosophy is a flowering of conceptual invention in response to an eruption of the real that problematizes our conception of reality. It is rare throughout history and intermittent. Normal philosophy, by contrast, would be long periods of conceptual stability where we tinker about the edges, clarifying conceptual inventions and applying them to ever-broadening fields of phenomena, showing again and again their conceptual fecundity and effectiveness for resolving local problems. In Lacanian terms, we can characterize the two styles of philosophy as the analyst discourse and philosophy as the university discourse. We attempt to show that phenomenology, Hegel, Marx, or even Deleuze is adequate to all possible phenomena, for example, when we are doing philosophy in the form of a university discourse. I wish to suggest that the eruption of the real in our own time, that which calls us to think and forge concepts adequate to our time, is the naming of the Anthropocene. I say the naming of the Anthropocene and not simply the Anthropocene, for there is quite some debate as to just when it began. Some scientists suggest that it began in 15,000 years ago with the advent of agriculture. Others suggest that it began with the Industrial Revolution. The term has still not been officially adopted by geologists, though perhaps that is changing. With the naming of the Anthropocene, a new signifier is introduced into the field of the symbolic that calls for us to rethink the planet, our place on the planet, and the nature of society. The Anthropocene names that period of geological history where humanity becomes the primary force or driver of climate and the environment. Where climate in the past was perhaps primarily driven by factors such as large volcanic explosions, massive and long-lasting forest fires, meteor impacts and variations in solar output, among other things. It is now primarily driven by fossil fuel emissions, agriculture, and livestock, all deeply tied to industry and capitalism. These things have fundamentally altered the entire nature of the globe, both on the surface of the planet, the depths of the ocean, and the upper reaches of the atmosphere. It is something of a misnomer to call the Anthropocene, for this suggests a degree of agency that we lack. Rather, the Anthropocene might be best thought by the figure of the golem in Jewish folklore. In these stories, a sorcerer fashions a powerful golem out of clay and mud to do his bidding. Inevitably, the sorcerer loses control of the golem and it goes on rampage, killing both him and many people in the village. This is how it is with the Anthropocene. In Civilization and Its Discontents, Freud famously said that we have become prosthetic gods through our technology. We took ourselves to have mastered the world and to have transformed it in our own image, making it become what Hegel called objective spirit. Yet it turns out that our mastery was an illusion, that our technologies and agriculture were golems that have an agency within them that we did not know or anticipate and that take on, metaphorically speaking, a life of their own when released into the world. It is this lesson that we should take from Sverholt. When you are in Sverholt, you take yourself to be in what we normally call the wilderness, where you take yourself to be in a remote, uninhabited region of the world overgrown by plants and overrun by reindeer, foxes, and various birds. Yet if you look more closely, you will everywhere see the traces of humanity and how humanity has transformed this place. This transformation is not just present in the ruins and the destroyed portion of the Atlantic Wall, the prehistoric home foundations, the old roads, the decaying fishing village, and the POW camp. No, it is there in the drift on the beaches that comes from all over the world, drift that blows quite far inland due to the heavy winds. It is even there in the plant life. Down in the fishing village, you encounter vibrant green, spiky nettles that you might take to be the epitome of nature. I had to spend a great deal of time cutting a path through these nettles so that we could easily and safely reach the beach on the other side of the isthmus. However, the nettles are far from natural. They used to process whales and seals for oil, food, and many other things in the village. Phosphates seeped into the ground as a result of that processing process. It is these phosphates that make the nettles the vibrant green that they are and so abundant. The Anthropocene is the horizon of thought today. The central concept that the Anthropocene calls us for us to think, I think, is the wilderness. I begin with a wager or declaration. The wilderness, I wish to say, is all there is. This is the central thesis or commitment of what I call wilderness ontology or wilderness philosophy. It is crucial to note that in this wager, I use a universal quantifier. I say all. To say that the wilderness is all that there is to say that the wilderness is without exception. Alternatively, it is to say that there is nothing that is not of the wilderness or the wild. Clearly, then, that there is something of a paradox in this wager. And to be completely forthright, I'm not at all sure that it can be coherently elaborated, which is why I have spoken and published so little about it to date. If this declaration is to be taken seriously and to the letter, then I am guilty of abusing or perverting language. For when we hear the signifier wilderness, we think of that which is undomesticated, wild, and outside of civilization and society. The wilderness, we think, is nature in the greenest and most untouched sense of the word. The wilderness is here conventionally thought as that which arises from itself according to its own essence, without the intervention of form-giving humans. The acorn left to its own devices grows into an oak tree, not a table or chair. It is only through the intervention of humans that the oak tree becomes a chair. I will call this the traditional concept of the wilderness. However, if we say that the wilderness is all there is, then clearly this conception of the wilderness becomes untenable. For the city, civilizations, and societies are a part of all there is. In other words, if the wilderness is all there is, then I am no less in the wilderness when I sit in Cat's Deli in New York City than when I am in a remote, perhaps never before seen region of the Australian outback. Both are of the wilderness. Consequently, if we commit to the experiment of conceiving the wilderness as all there is, then we will also be committing to the foreclosure of any conception of the wilderness that treats it as the untouched wilds outside of civilization and society. This will require the mutation and reworking of a number of core concepts related to the distinctions we make between nature and culture, and, I contend, that make up the unconscious conceptual grammar, what Derrida referred to as philosophemes and Foucault referred to as epistemes, of not only Western philosophy, but of all of our disciplines and practices. Today, I will not discuss the contours of what I take a wilderness ontology or philosophy to be in detail, as that would take us too far afield. Rather, I will focus on what wilderness ontology, at the level of what I take to be a deep grammar of Western thought akin to what Heidegger diagnoses under the title of ontotheology and Derrida under the title of logocentrism and philosophies of present, aims to unsettle and critique. Minimally, we can say that wilderness philosophy refuses all vertical ontologies of transcendence, instead striving to conceptualize us as entangled among and enmeshed in other beings that make up the field of what is, a Spinozist orientation of thought. In this regard, it is a thoroughgoing naturalism, though of an unusual sort. Important forerunners and contributors to wilderness ontology are Lucretius, Spinoza, Whitehead, Deleuze, Jane Bennett, Donna Haraway, Stacy Alaimo, and Karen Barad. There are no doubt many others besides. I do not claim that all of these thinkers are arguing the same thing, but I do think that in one form or another, all of them propose horizontal ontologies conceiving being as a flat plane of immanence without vertical transcendence, where humanity is among and entangled in beings, rather than a sovereign king of being different in kind from all else that is, and where culture is thought of as of nature rather than outside of nature. Inasmuch as we can still talk of nature and culture, both terms must be placed under erasure, as we cannot maintain them as we once axiomatically did, but also cannot completely abandon them. They are too deeply ingrained in our conceptual unconscious to be completely foreclosed. Perhaps at some point in the future, we will become capable of thinking without these concepts. Wilderness ontology can be opposed to what I call civilized ontology, which is a domesticating form of thought that attempts to tame and foreclose the wilds that I claim are at the heart of being and which, I think, are one of the central objects of investigation for the Unruly Heritage Project. Civilized philosophy or ontology, I wish to say, contributes to what I call the wasteland. I will return to that later. Clearly, this proposal is doomed to leave many, if not most, dissatisfied. The deep ecologists will object to my erasure of the natural and untouched outside, to my suggestion that floating islands of plastic in the oceans are also of the wilderness. Humanists will object to my refusal to mark a hard break, a red line between the human and the animal, the cultural and the natural, claiming that placing the human and cultural in and within nature undermines the dignity of man. What then might authorize this twisting, perversion, abuse, and distortion of language? In making a go of the wager that the wilderness is all that there is, I aim to unsettle a series of distinctions or binary oppositions organized around the culture-nature distinction. In placing the traditional concept of the wilderness under erasure, then this is to unsettle a series of distinctions in which the cultural term is always hegemonic and the natural term is always subaltern. I aim to install a chiasmatic crossing of properties between culture and nature, such that culture comes to be thought as a bit more embedded in nature, and nature comes to be conceived as embodying many of the properties traditionally reserved for culture. If we ought to rethink the concept of the wilderness, I think this is for two reasons, one ontic and de facto, the other ontological and de jure. At the ontic and de facto level, we find ourselves in a historical moment characterized by the Anthropocene, where the culture-nature distinction has become untenable and destructive. Insofar as the age of the Anthropocene is that epoch where human industry and agriculture have so fundamentally impacted the surface of the planet that there is no longer a wilds outside of culture and civilization, it follows that the traditional concept of the wilderness becomes untenable. De facto, we live on a planet where we can no longer reliably delineate the natural and the cultural. At the ontological and de jure level, I wish to claim that Western thought is structured by an unconscious series of conceptual oppositions that organize our thought practices and how we apprehend the world about us. These oppositions form an ontological grammar in and through which thought and practice unfold, determining what is visible and invisible in the sense of Heidegger's aletheia, what we value, and how we investigate the world. It is my view that these oppositions, which form the core of civilized philosophy, have contributed heavily to the production of the Anthropocene. Consequently, if true, the Anthropocene is not simply a material formation arising from the way in which human agriculture and industry have transformed the world, but also arises from an expressive component of thought and is a particular way of thinking the nature of being. The chief opposition in civilized philosophy is that between culture and nature. Closely related to this fundamental distinction or conceptual opposition are the distinctions between form and matter, subject and object, mind and body, the active and the passive, being and becoming, the identical and the different, the present and the past, the civilized and the uncivilized, and the masculine and the feminine. Taking a page from Lévi-Strauss, we could say that civilized philosophy is organized around an opposition between the cooked and the raw. That which pertains to nature and materiality is the raw, while that which pertains to culture and the intellect is the cooked. We all know, of course, that it is dangerous to eat that which is raw, unless it is sushi, tartare, or carpaccio. As I suggested earlier, in each of these oppositions, one term is treated as hegemonic and the other is treated as subaltern. There is thus a dimension of valuation at work in the philosophemes that make up the structure of civilized philosophy. It is not simply that these distinctions cut being at the joints, as Plato suggested we should strive to do, nor is it simply that these distinctions are descriptive, but rather that one of the terms is for the most part always treated as the privileged and of greater value, the hegemonic term, and the other term is treated as subordinate, a support in need of being tamed and domesticated, and even as dangerous. It will be noted that within civilized philosophy, the hegemonic term always indexes the mind or intellect, while the subaltern term indexes some element of materiality. Here we might think the great chain of being, where we encounter a vertical hierarchical ontology in which those beings that are beings in the most eminent and genuine sense are the ideal, intellectual, permanent, enduring, and eternal, while those characterized by materiality and becoming are seen as the least real. If I were to hazard a hypothesis as to how we come to value the hegemonic terms over the subaltern terms, I would say that it arises out of a repression of our finitude and a will to domination. Civilized philosophy, it might be said, dreams of a foreclosure of death and labor, which requires a foreclosure of the body and materiality. This, of course, is impossible, yet it is nonetheless a fantasy, I believe, animating civilized ontology, functioning at its heart and instigating what Adorno referred to as idealism as rage. Civilized philosophy always tends towards idealism and the reduction of the thing to the ideal. for it is the ideal, the conceptual, over which we have mastery. It will be said that while we draw intellectual distinctions between form and matter, the reality is that the two terms are inseparable. This is true, yet nonetheless, there is a devaluation of the material and a valuation of the formal. Consider your body. Despite all of the marvelous things about our bodies, such as dance and extraordinary athletic feats, our bodies are the site of aging, fatigue, hunger, sickness, and desires that torment us. It is easy to fantasize about being freed from our bodies, of no longer being shackled to them, and this is perhaps why so many of us dream of flying. Certainly this dream would be behind the transhumanist movement. Similarly, matter is the site of labor. We must make a detour through things and their stubborn obstinance to obey and satisfy our desires. Freud suggests that the young infant attempts to satisfy his desires in a hallucinatory fashion. When the bottle is absent, the story goes, he imagines or fantasizes the bottle. For the infant, there is not yet any distinction between the imaginary bottle and the real bottle. Very quickly, the infant learns that hallucinated bottles do not satisfy. Imaginary bottles do not smell like anything, taste like anything, and produce no sense of warmth in the belly. These experiences of disappointment, he says, will be the origin of the reality principle. The infant learns to satisfy its desires, it must make a detour through reality or materiality. It is the disappointment of our fantasy of omnipotence, of being able to produce satisfaction through imagination or thought alone, that will be the seed of our concept of the real. We can therefore hypothesize there is a primordial ontological rage with respect to the real, a resentment, an anger due to the manner in which it humiliates our fantasies of omnipotence. The hegemonic terms of civilized philosophy are characterized by tractability, fungibility, and iterability. They are that upon which we can gain purchase and mastery. The subaltern terms are characterized by the unruly and wild, to a greater or lesser degree evading our mastery and control. In Negative Dialectics and Lectures on Metaphysics, Adorno will say that matter is the concept of that which is not a concept. What might he mean by that? There is, of course, the obvious. My concept of a thing is not itself a thing. I can, of course, think of my concept of a thing whenever I like. It is therefore characterized by spontaneity and freedom. But while in my concept of bananas, I might grasp something of the essence of bananas, banananess, I cannot eat my concept of banananess. I cannot hold the concept of banananess, slip on the concept of banananess, throw it at another person, nor all the rest. No matter how talented someone might be as a poet, their description of banananess will not nourish the starving person. To speak paradoxically, no matter how sticky or rough a bit of matter is, there is a certain slipperiness to all matter. The non-concept of matter names that which it perpetually slips away from thought and that cannot be mastered by thought. There is always something of the thing that cannot be said or thought. As such, matter marks our impotence. It is the unruliness, the wildness at the heart of being. It is natural to conclude that what cannot be thought or articulated is nothing at all. In the Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel will open by arguing that the truth of the particular, of the thing, of that which is presented to us in sense certainty, is the universal, the formal. All that we say of the particular, he notes, is through the medium of language, and language is composed entirely of general or universal terms. I can never say the singularity of the thing, its thisness. This is part of the trauma of trauma, and is a primordial wound at the heart of our relationship to being. One can never fully put it into words. It is the universal, Hegel says, that is tractable. More recently, in their book Everything Must Go, James Ladyman and Don Ross will rail against what they think of as the myth of matter, arguing for a realism not from the Pythagoreans or Plato that holds, not far from the Pythagoreans or Plato, that holds that reality is composed of nothing but structure or what is tractable and fungible mathematically. In short, the things themselves get reduced to the formula that describe and predict the behavior of the things themselves, erasing the remainder or that which cannot be grasped within form or the concept. Within civilized philosophy, there is a tendency towards the erasure of matter common to rationalisms, idealisms, and social constructivisms. If it cannot be thought or articulated, then it is nothing at all. Apparently, these thinkers forgot the phenomenon of pointing. Civilized ontology, I want to suggest, leads to the formation of the wasteland. Borrowing from Deleuze and Guattari, Recall that according to them, all assemblages are composed of a plane of expression and a plane of content. In the case of human assemblages, the plane of expression corresponds to what they call collective assemblages of enunciation. Collective assemblages of enunciation can be thought as an order of collective signifiers, signs, concepts, and norms structuring the way in which a collectivity encounters the world and thinks. Think of collective assemblages of enunciation by analogy to national borders and lines of latitude and longitude on the globe. They are not physically there, but nonetheless have very real effects. The plane of content, by contrast, corresponds to what they call machinic assemblages. Machinic assemblages refer to how bodies or objects are interrelated within an assemblage. The wasteland can thus be thought of as having an expressive enunciative dimension and a machinic dimension. At the level of collective assemblages of enunciation, I think that civilized ontology has contributed to leading us to a wasteland of values. The wasteland, in part, consists of a certain way of thinking value. I confess that I'm very nervous about this thesis and am not at all sure how to defend it. Within the wasteland, I wish to say, value has become a form of bad infinity. As articulated by Hegel, bad infinities have the structure of n+1, in which closure is never reached. In the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle drew a distinction between that which is valuable for its own sake and that which is valuable for the sake of something else. We can call these absolute and relative values respectively. Absolute values, or things that are valuable for their own sake, are things like beauty, friendship, love, health, and the satisfaction of wonder and intellectual curiosity. No doubt there are many other things that are intrinsically or absolutely valuable. These things are absolute in the twofold sense that we value them for themselves and in the sense that they are not for anything else. If we were to ask someone why they value health, they would probably look at us in confusion, perhaps wondering whether we're mad, and would respond with some variation of the tautology that we value health because it's good. Neither health, friendship, or beauty need any further justifications. They are ultimate justifiers. Likewise, the person who said that they valued their friend because of all the ways they benefit from her would be no friend at all. They would not have understood what friendship is. Absolute values are those things for the sake of which we live and that make life worth living. They are the ultimate reason and teloi of all of our action and are components of what Heidegger called care. Relative values are things that are valuable for the sake of something else and are things like work, horse training, perhaps cooking, and so on. They are valuable as a means to an end rather than valuable in and of themselves. If I here express my uncertainty, it is because I do not know how to credibly defend the existence of absolute values or how we might come to know them, even if I am nonetheless committed to their existence in my bones. As the wasteland grows, there has been a twilight of absolute values. They no longer are at the center of our lives nor of our societies, but instead become increasingly seen as frivolous and even invisible. Instead, under the apex of civilized ontology, utility and instrumentality have become the central values. It is in this sense that within the wasteland, we find ourselves trapped in a bad infinity. Utility and instrumentality and their siblings, innovation, their sibling, have, and in a perverse way, come to be valued for their own sake and have become monstrous absolute values. For example, in the case of education, it becomes increasingly difficult to imagine learning as being valuable for its own sake, to imagine our lives as being richer as a result of knowing history, the creations of culture, the beauty of mathematics, and the wonders of the universe. Rather, education must be preparation for a job. It must be for something. And as far as our pedagogy goes, many of us must show that we are innovating yearly. In short, there is no longer any destination for the sake of which we might innovate, and things are only valued for the sake of their utility and instrumentality. Such a way of valuing would arise out of civilized philosophy's drive to domination and mastery. At the expressive level, the wasteland dreams of being as completely civilized, completely domesticated, which is to say, free of the wild. Domesticated or civilized being would be being dominated by form, the intellect, and the complete absence of the objection of matter. It would be being reduced to smooth space. It aims at the transformation of being into what Hegel called objective spirit. Objective spirit is the materialization of thought and matter, objects, and things of being. It is matter that has been tamed and given form, such as the rose we see all about us in the finely manicured gardens. The wasteland that issues from civilized ontology dreamt of a civilized being so civilized that no nature exists at all. That was the dream of the conquest of nature. Yet foundations shift and cracks appear in walls. At the level of the machinic assemblage of the wasteland, we encounter waste. It is true that all human assemblages are entropic and necessarily produce waste. What distinguishes the wasteland of civilized philosophy is the scale at which it is produced. In the drive to reduce all of being to the instrumental in utility, the remainder of the non-functional is produced. In the endless drive towards innovation for the sake of innovation, that which is given form loses its status as the innovative and becomes a sort of remnant of being, a walking dead, that is to say, no being at all. The object becomes abject, and from the standpoint of civilized ontology, no being at all. It is a waste being, and also an embarrassment to the pretensions of civilized ontology. As such, it must be foreclosed, thrown out, abandoned. Insofar as the wasteland at the level of the expressive plane codes only that which is useful and instrumental as being a being, the expulsion of the abject object is registered as its complete eradication. Out of sight, out of mind. Mountains of waste, abandoned buildings, abandoned chemicals accumulate, creating a hypermidden pit no archaeologist could have ever dreamt of. Insofar as the being of beings is thought as their utility, these objects are thought as dead objects. In the reduction of objects to their being, rejecting their becoming, that which has no utility is thought as no being at all. We need not worry. The things just lay there in their crypts, for agency is only found on the side of the living and the human. And so the machinic level, the wasteland, endlessly expands and grows. Yet the objects object. Things are not docile and inert. They are not passive, nor are they simply their use and instrumentality. They have a life and vitality within them, continuing to act and become, even though we might no longer act upon them and use them. As Jane Bennett remarks, nothing can ever be truly thrown out. There is a life to the thing that is the thing's own and that does not arise simply from us. A moment ago, I said foundations shift and crack. I intended this as a sort of double entendre, hoping to evoke a literal and figurative meaning. At the literal level, here in North Texas, our homes are built on soil that has high clay content. This makes for unstable home foundations. If you don't regularly water your foundations, and even when you do regularly water your foundations, they will shift, your walls, patio, and driveway will crack, and doors and windows will not close. Despite being cared for, our home has required foundation work 3 times now. In addition to the cracks in our walls, a large number of growing cracks bifurcate our driveway. There is a wilderness, a wildness at the heart of things, an unruliness in which objects object and reveal their own life and agency in contrast to the pretensions of objective spirit. At the figurative level, the story of my home foundations can be taken as a parable about the pretensions of civilized philosophy. Civilized philosophy dreams of eradicating waste and mastering the material and the natural. It strives to do this both at the level of thought and practice. Yet at the heart of all beings is wild, unruly being, the life of things beyond form that we impose. Freud said that there is never an absolute repression. Rather, for every act of repression, there is a return of the repressed. The thought that I would prefer not to face comes back in the form of the symptom. This is what happens with civilized ontology as well. Civilized ontology strives to repress the material, the body, and the natural, the wild object. Yet this repression is accompanied by a return of the repressed in the form of waste that is unruly and that disrupts the civilized world that it has so laboriously striven to construct. Paradoxically, it is through this return of the repressed that the wilderness is discovered. For we discover that we cannot escape nature, but are ineluctably entangled with the broader than civilized world upon which we depend to exist. And that is it.